Colorado artist Gregg Deal is a husband, a father, an activist, and a member of the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe. Some of his work deals with indigenous identity and the stereotypes that have developed around it. Here's his story by photographer Paul Sawilko.
We do our best to assert our identity, but our identity is not ours. We find ourselves on your flour and on your cigarettes and your baking powder and football helmets. While we journey our human lives, we must navigate the landmines that hold shadows of who we are expected to be and not who we actually are. Everything that I do is a mixed bag. Everything from painting to murals to performance art to spoken word to speaking in public to even just installations. And so it allows me to have a voice that is very broad. A lot of people will say that I'm a Native American artist or that I'm trying to enter into this gate of Native American art. And I think that's false. I don't speak for Indian country. I've never claimed to speak for Indian country. I speak to my experience. I'm a contemporary artist, and so as a contemporary artist, I'm expressing myself as a person. And it just so happens that some of my contemporary conversation is about my indigeneity, because that is my experience as a human being. My sister and I growing up had a decidedly indigenous experience in the way that we were sometimes treated or the names that we were called. Trying to come to grips with those things and trying to sort of reconcile those things for yourself, it's very therapeutic using art to sort of express those things and kind of deal with those things. Much of my work deals with identity specifically because dealing with identity is my experience as a kid, my experience now as an adult, but also my experience as I see my kids grow up. We're talking about how we perceive ourselves. And sometimes perceiving ourselves means having to deal with mascot imagery or deal with Hollywood tropes. And it kind of all funnels down into this sort of pan-Indian concept. You have to look a certain way, you have to act a certain way, you have to talk a certain way in order to be indigenous. And in a sort of post-colonial culture, the indigenous voice is oftentimes not given value. The value of indigenous voices have to be facilitated by somebody who belongs to the dominant culture. That's why you see Kevin Costner in Dances with Wolves and Daniel Day-Lewis, in Last Mohicans, and even why somebody like Johnny Depp plays Tonto, which is crazy because the original television version of Tonto was played by Jay Silverheels, who was Native. And so if I point it out and I start illustrating it, caricaturizing this sort of ridiculous interaction that natives have to have with the rest of the world. The value of those indigenous voices become an important part of the dialogue. The Indian Voice Removal Act of 1879 to 2016 was an installation with the Smithsonian. I erected a very big teepee. I had a series of paintings inside the teepee, and as the performance aspect, I had a cultural interpreter, a Caucasian fellow that I've worked with before, Jeremy Gann, and the public would engage us in a way that was sending a message. They'd ask me a question, I'd give him the answer, and he would give them the answer. And the whole piece was about the value of indigenous voices, that they had to be cycled through him in order to make it back to the viewer, which is an excellent metaphor to sort of how Native people are engaged, publicly now. Most of my performance art creates an incredible dialogue and sometimes arguments.
What tribe are you from, sir?
The Last American Indian on Earth is a performance art piece that's based on stereotype and taking that stereotype into public and documenting the way that Americans interact with the indigenous image, an image that most Americans don't realize is fake.
And that's important. Yes, ma'am.
I embodied essentially the stereotype to go into public to capture moments that exist within American culture. I've heard some people call it like shallow and self-serving, that it's just basically me getting out there and just trying to gain attention. I spent a lot of time trying to reconcile putting on these fake items that exist solely to consume the indigenous image and not to actually lift up or to enrich indigenous communities or indigenous cultures. It is so incredibly difficult to put on a fake headdress made in China and to put on fake leggings and fake beads that were pre-assembled. But I think that anybody who doesn't actually look at those things critically to really understand what that embodies, they're not engaging the work the way that it's meant to be engaged. So if I can take something like a stereotype and I can regurgitate that stereotype, it has a completely different meaning and it has a completely different interaction with the public, then that becomes a source of strength to turning those voices around. And they really end up looking like a social mirror. And so if something I do touches one person, that's worth it to me. I think the general American public likes art, and most of the time can even dismiss it pretty quickly. But the place where art becomes really influential and really important is the way that art and artists capture the things that are around them. They capture culture, they capture events, they capture social ideas. And so art plays these roles that are sometimes subtle and sometimes not subtle at all. And the only way that that keeps happening is you have to keep creating, and you have to keep looking at the world and thinking critically about the world that we're in and talking about these things and making statements and not being afraid to express yourself so that the next generation knows that they can do the same thing.